On the frozen plains of the 1800s, a lone farmer discovers a frightened Comanche girl on the brink of death. His act of kindness sparks danger, honor, and a circle of warriors he never expected. Watch how one choice can change lives forever. Subscribe now. Where are you watching from? Let's get started. The winter dusk spread like a cold veil across the empty plains as Thomas Reed trudged home from the river, his tools slung over one shoulder. The sky burned in fading orange, the kind that warned of a long, freezing night ahead. The land felt quiet, too quiet, until something shifted near his fence line. At first he thought it was an animal, maybe a wounded deer dragging itself across the frost, but then the shape faltered, stumbled, and collapsed completely. Thomas froze. Even from a distance he could tell the figure was small, far too small to be a grown person, and trembling violently in the cold. His boots crunched through the brittle grass as he approached slowly. The shape became clearer in the dying light, a young Comanche girl, no more than 15, her dress torn, her braids undone, her breathing shallow like frightened whispers. She tried to push herself up but failed, collapsing again with a painful gasp. Thomas lifted his hands, palms outward, moving with deliberate gentleness. A lifetime of frontier living had taught him that fear could make even the weakest heart lash out like a cornered animal. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm not here to harm you." His voice softened, barely above the cold wind brushing the plains. The girl's eyes, dark, glassy, full of terror, flickered toward him. She attempted to speak, but her voice cracked into silence. She shook her head weakly, as if refusing something unseen. Thomas could see her fingers trembling violently against the frozen ground. She had been running, hurt and alone, for far too long. Every warning he had ever heard echoed in his mind. Don't get involved with tribal matters. Don't take what isn't yours. Don't bring trouble to your door. But the warnings felt distant compared to the fragile life shivering at his feet. Compassion, not caution, struck deepest in moments like these. He crouched beside her, noticing fresh scrapes on her arms, dirt smeared across her dress, and a bruise forming along her jawline. She had suffered. There was no mistaking that. "You're hurt," he whispered. She blinked once, slowly, and Thomas took it as permission to come closer. He reached out, carefully, respectfully. When he touched her shoulder, she tensed in pure instinct, but she didn't pull away. Her strength was nearly gone. Thomas felt the sharp rise and fall of her breath under his fingertips. She was burning with fever, trembling from cold and exhaustion both. She wouldn't survive another hour out here. He slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her with all the caution he would use on a wounded bird. She weighed so little it startled him. "I've got you," he murmured. The girl winced, clinging to consciousness with thin threads. Her head rested against his chest, her breath warm but faint. The long walk back to his cabin felt heavier with every step, not because of her weight, but because of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. A Comanche girl on a white man's farm. Such a thing would draw questions, trouble, and accusations he wasn't prepared to answer. Yet he kept walking. The wind whipped around them, carrying the smell of snow. Twilight deepened, turning the plains into shifting shadows. Thomas adjusted his hold, trying to shield her from the cold. Her fingers curled weakly into his coat, not in trust, but in desperate instinct to hold on to something solid, something warm. When his cabin finally came into view, small, lonely, standing against the wide world, Thomas felt a wave of relief he didn't expect. He pushed the door open with his boot, guiding her inside. Warmth flooded the room from the dying fire he had left burning earlier, enough to soften her shivering. He laid her gently on the cot near the fireplace. The girl's eyes fluttered, drifting between awareness and unconsciousness. Thomas quickly stoked the fire back to life, stacking logs until the flames licked high and bright. Heat spilled across the room, warming her pale, trembling hands. Slowly, her clenched breaths loosened. He dipped a cloth into warm water and wrung it out, then pressed it lightly against her forehead. She flinched but did not resist. The fever was unmistakable. Her skin burned while her body shook as if she were made of winter. Thomas frowned, wondering how long she had been wandering alone. The torn fabric of her dress revealed more wounds. Scratches across her arms, a swollen ankle, and bruises shaped not by accident, but by hands. Thomas's jaw tightened. Someone had hurt her. Someone had chased her. And whoever it was might not be far behind. He felt the old, familiar chill of danger. He grabbed a wool blanket and draped it over her shoulders. The girl's breathing steadied as warmth wrapped around her. "You're safe here," Thomas whispered. He doubted she understood every word, but she understood the tone. Something inside her unclenched, just slightly, at the softness she had probably not felt in weeks. She whispered something in Comanche, voice trembling. Thomas didn't know the words, but he recognized the fear behind them. "No one will hurt you," he promised quietly. His hand hovered near hers, offering comfort without forcing it. After a hesitant moment, her tiny fingers brushed against his, a fragile gesture of trust. Thomas knew that trust came at a steep price on the frontier. People judged quickly, punished even quicker. If anyone discovered her here, especially warriors from her tribe, it might be seen as kidnapping, an offense beyond forgiveness. The thought gnawed at him, yet he couldn't bring himself to push her away. As the firelight glowed across the room, Thomas studied her face more closely. Beneath the dirt and bruises, she was beautiful in the innocent way of youth, with features shaped by a people who had lived in these lands long before anyone like him arrived. She deserved safety, not cruelty. Outside, night deepened into a silent black ocean. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries sharp against the cold air. Thomas checked the door's lock and shuttered the windows. Each sound outside made him glance toward the horizon, half expecting shadows of riders, half dreading what their arrival might mean for him. He brewed warm broth and coaxed her into drinking a few sips. She obeyed weakly, grateful yet barely conscious. Her trembling eased as heat spread through her chest. For the first time since he found her, color returned faintly to her cheeks. She blinked, eyes softening, lingering on his face. "You're safe," Thomas repeated, unsure if he was reassuring her or himself. He dipped the cloth again, cooling her fevered skin. She watched him with a mixture of confusion and wonder, as if kindness from a stranger was a concept too foreign to accept. Slowly, she let herself breathe without fear. When exhaustion finally overtook her, her eyes drifted shut. Thomas pulled the blanket higher, tucking it beneath her chin. She sighed, a small, fragile sound of relief that pierced him deeper than any storm or rifle. He sat beside the fire, refusing to sleep, keeping watch like a silent guardian. The night passed slowly, filled with crackling firewood and distant wind. Thomas's thoughts ran wild. Who was she running from? What danger pushed her to collapse near his farm? And what would happen when her people discovered she was gone? Trouble was coming. He could feel it like electricity in the air. Yet despite every fear, every warning, he couldn't regret his choice. Leaving her outside would have been a death sentence. Saving her felt like something he was meant to do, something the lonely quiet of his life had prepared him for. Compassion sometimes outweighed caution, even in the unforgiving West. As dawn crept toward the horizon, Thomas looked at the girl, sleeping peacefully, for the first time in who knows how long. Her small form beneath the blanket, the soft rise and fall of her breath. These simple signs of survival filled him with fierce protectiveness. Whatever storm awaited, he would face it. Thomas stood in the doorway of his small cabin, the cold air burning his lungs as the circle of warriors tightened around the farm he had built with his own hands. Their horses snorted clouds of steam, and sunlight glinted off spears and long rifles. He had known mercy came with risk, but he had not expected danger to arrive before dawn. For a moment, he could only stare. It wasn't anger in their faces that frightened him, it was the silence. Silence so thick it felt older than the land itself. These men weren't some passing band of raiders. They were riders of purpose, answering a call he had unwittingly given by saving. The girl now trembling behind him, Thomas swallowed hard and raised both hands slowly, palms open in a gesture of peace. His heart hammered with a force that made his vision swim, but he forced his voice steady. "She's hurt," he said. "I didn't mean any—" A tall warrior nudged his horse forward. His hair was braided with red-dyed cord, his face painted in sharp streaks that matched the dawn sky. He looked Thomas over the way one judged a trespasser or a fool, yet there was something measured behind his eyes, something that did not rush to violence. Inside the cabin, the girl cried out weakly, her voice thin as wind through dry grass. The sound cut through the morning like a blade. A murmur rippled among the warriors. The tall rider turned sharply at the sound, and something unspoken moved through the ranks. Recognition, fear, relief. Thomas couldn't tell. He stepped aside from the doorway, letting them see she was alive, not bound, not struck, simply resting beneath blankets he had wrapped around her shaking body. "She collapsed on my land," he said, breath frosting as he spoke. "I didn't want her to die out there." Another rider spoke, rapid Comanche words that Thomas couldn't decipher. The tall warrior nodded slowly, then dismounted with a grace that made no sound. Boots touched the earth like he was greeting an old friend, not preparing for war. Thomas braced himself, unsure if the man meant to enter or strike him down where he stood. But the warrior simply pointed inside the cabin. Thomas understood. He stepped back. The warrior pushed past him, ducking slightly beneath the cabin's low doorway. Firelight washed over his painted face as he knelt beside the girl. She tried to sit up, reaching for him with trembling fingers. A broken string of Comanche words tumbled from her mouth, words that cracked with relief. The warrior pressed a hand gently to her forehead, then looked toward Thomas with something new in his expression. Gratitude. Grudging, perhaps, but unmistakable. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Outside, the warriors remained watchful, surrounding the cabin like a living wall. Their stillness carried weight. Every second felt carved from stone. Thomas's farm had never felt so small, never felt like such fragile ground between two worlds. The warrior lifted the blanket slightly, examining her wounds. A deep cut along her side, bruising on her ribs, dried blood at her temple. She had been running, Thomas realized, from something violent, something meant to kill. She whispered again, and the warrior responded softly, a tone Thomas had not expected from a man who carried so much power in his stance. Then the warrior rose, stepping back outside. Thomas followed, heart forcing itself forward step by step. The tall warrior barked a command. 3 riders dismounted, each carrying healing satchels, cloth strips, and small carved boxes. Thomas blinked, surprised. He had expected anger, accusation, interrogation, not this sudden movement toward healing. They entered the cabin, working with swift precision, whispering prayers as they cleaned and stitched the girl's wounds. Thomas stayed pressed against the far wall, unsure whether to remain or give space. He watched with the uneasy respect of a man seeing a world he'd never understood. The tall warrior turned back to him. "She is daughter of our chief," he said in thick, accented English, "taken by men who hunt our people. She escaped. You found her." He paused. "This is good." Thomas nodded, unsure what to say. "I only did what any man should." The warrior's gaze sharpened. "Not every man does." Thomas shifted his weight, rubbing his calloused palms together to hide his shaking. "What happens now?" The warrior stepped closer, his shadow long across the frosted ground. "We take her home, but we do not leave without knowing your heart." "My heart?" Thomas repeated. "You gave shelter to one you were taught to fear. The warrior's eyes narrowed. Some show kindness for reward, some for fear, some because it is right. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. I did it because she was a child, hurt, alone, because leaving her in the snow would have been wrong in the eyes of any decent man. The warrior studied him for several moments, as though weighing his soul. Then he nodded once, slow, deliberate. Approval. Behind them, the girl cried out again, but this time the tone was different, less fear, more pain from the stitching. The healers murmured to her, their voices soft, like a river against stone. Thomas turned toward the cabin, worry tugging at him. "She will live," the tall warrior said, "because of you." Thomas exhaled shakily. He hadn't realized how deeply he needed to hear those words. Hours passed as the sun climbed slowly across the winter sky. The warriors formed a protective half-circle now, rather than a full one, no longer treating Thomas as threat, but as witness. Smoke drifted from the cabin chimney, carrying the scent of heated herbs and pine sap. When the girl finally emerged, supported by two women, her steps were fragile but steady. She blinked into the light and then looked toward Thomas. Not with fear now, but with a soft, grateful recognition. She whispered something. Thomas couldn't translate it, but the tall warrior did. "She says you are her friend." Thomas's throat tightened. "I didn't do anything special." "She thinks you did." The horses were brought forward. The girl was lifted gently onto a painted mare. She winced at the movement, but did not cry out. She kept her gaze on Thomas, as though memorizing him before the world pulled her away again. The tall warrior mounted his own horse, then looked down at Thomas. "If she had died," he said quietly, "war might have followed. Not by your doing, but by grief and anger that twist men's hearts." His voice softened. "You saved more than one life." Thomas stared at the frozen ground, overwhelmed by a weight he had never asked to carry. "I just did what was right," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. The warrior gave him a rare smile, small but real. Right choices are never small. The circle of riders tightened around the girl. The wind picked up, carrying snow crystals like drifting glass. Thomas wrapped his arms around himself, watching as the people he had feared all his life prepared to leave. But before they turned away, the girl lifted her hand toward him, a gesture faint as a snowflake, a farewell, a thank you, a promise he couldn't yet understand. The tall warrior raised two fingers to his brow, a gesture of respect. "Should you ever call for help," he said, "the Comanche will remember." And then, with a thunder of hooves that shook the earth, they were gone. The winter plain swallowed them, leaving only distant echoes fading into the horizon. Thomas stood alone beside the fence where he had first found her, the cold whispering around him. The land looked the same, quiet, empty, vast. But he was not the same man who walked home from the river the day before. He had reached across a line carved by fear and old stories. He had chosen compassion instead of safety. And in doing so, he had given a child back to her people, and saved something fragile in himself he didn't know was in danger. As the last echo of hoofbeats vanished, Thomas whispered into the quiet morning air, "Be safe, little one." He turned back toward his cabin, carrying the warmth of her final glance inside him, something bright enough to push against even the deepest winter cold.